Good morning. It's great to see you all this morning, and I appreciate you making it in today for the series as we're continuing our Life and Teachings of Jesus series. Sorry that I was out last week. I had a meeting at my home church and decided just to kind of take the day off that week to rest a bit. I also had to write a paper for a conference, and so that extra week off really helped me a lot. So my thanks to Pastor Daryl for filling in for me last week. And so, as he said, I'm the short, bald guy. He's the tall, bald guy. So hopefully none of you have any phobias about bald people, as he mentioned last week. But it's really great to be with you this morning once again. So today we're going to continue this series that Pastor Daryl and I have been going through on the life and teachings of Jesus. But as we get started, I'd like to show you a quick little video clip. It takes about 2 minutes. Take a look. What in the world does this prehistoric squirrel have to do with the life and teachings of Jesus? That's a good question. Here's my attempt at an answer. Our little buddy, his name's Scrat. He's from the Ice Age movies. Our little buddy Scrat gives us a little glimpse into the problem that's facing our main characters in today's message. This morning, we're going to be looking at the healing of a synagogue leader's daughter and looking at the healing of a woman with an ongoing health crisis. And as I read over their stories over and over again in preparation for today's message, I just couldn't get little Scrat out of my mind. It's that sense of desperation, right? For Scrat, it's going through all these great lengths to save his precious little acorn. And for our characters today, of course, their desperation is going to be much more serious. Now, as we get started this morning, don't raise your hand or shout out anything or anything like that, but have you ever been in a desperate situation? Probably didn't look like Scrat's, but perhaps for you, your desperate situation, maybe it was financial stress, some overwhelming debt, and you're wondering, how am I going to be able to pay my next mortgage payment? And you're desperate. Or maybe for you, your desperation was a broken relationship. You know, you've done everything you can from your end, but the other person just isn't playing along and you feel out of hope. Or perhaps like the synagogue leader this morning, your desperation might be like a sick child. You feel out of control. You know there's nothing you can do to fix it, and that just makes you totally depressed. You're desperate, nothing you can do. Or like the woman today, maybe your desperation season was, or perhaps even is right now as I speak, an ongoing health crisis. The doctors have tried everything, but you're not getting any better, and you're desperate. These, of course, are all serious examples of desperation. Now, maybe this morning you've never faced anything quite like that, and if that's the case for you, give thanks to God that you haven't had to face something like that. But for most of us, I imagine, we've had these in-the-moment types of desperation, where it may be a short-lived desperation, but we feel that sense of longing. I'll give you an example. One example I can give you is a time when I was in college on a mission trip to Belarus. I have to give you a little bit of background first on this trip to Belarus. I like to drink a lot. I'm in a Baptist church. Let me be very clear. I like to drink a lot of non-alcoholic fluids, a lot. When I was in college, these non-alcoholic fluids were usually diet soda. Now I drink a whole lot of tea. I think I drink enough tea to keep a small Chinese green tea business and running, you know. I got my jasmine green tea right up here with me. Well, anyway, back to Belarus. I like to drink a lot, as I said. But I quickly realized that in Belarus, that's not really an option. Where I was serving in Belarus was not too far from where the Chernobyl disaster had happened. And so the locals warned us, don't drink the water, because you might get cancer or something like that. Bottled water was very hard to find, and it was quite expensive, and a lot of the bottled water I could find was carbonated, which now I'm really into, like bubbly and AHA and all that, but back then I wasn't. So carbonated water just wasn't doing it for me. And so I was thirsty like the entire week. And at one time, I got desperate. We were having supper at the host family's home, and the host family decided to give us a Belarusian delicacy. And I've learned as a picky eater that whenever anyone mentions a delicacy, I'm probably not going to like it. And the delicacy that they offered me was pickled herring. Now here's the other part of the story. I think many of you are with me on that one. I'm a pretty picky eater. I'm not proud of it. I'm just being honest. Like your toddler and I probably love the same kind of foods. I'm not very much a connoisseur when it comes to food. But I was at this host family's home, and they spent a lot of money to give us a delicacy, this pickled herring. And so I did what I had to do. I ate some of this pickled raw fish. I didn't have a choice. And as you can imagine, the second I ate that pickled raw fish, that herring, I started scanning the room for something to drink. There was no Diet Dr. Pepper to be seen anywhere, which would have been my drink of choice. There wasn't any water to drink down. I looked at the sink and started thinking, is it worth looking like the fish from Simpsons with the 3 eyes to wash down this pickled herring, or should I just tough it out? And eventually I determined that the only thing I could do is the thing my mama would have never expected. There was a cucumber next to me. I grabbed that cucumber and started munching down just to try to find something to wash down this pickled herring. It wasn't perfect, but it got me through. This is the kind of desperation I'm kind of talking about this morning. It's that feeling of hopelessness. I just ate something that is nasty, and I can't wash this thing down. That's a minor example. The big examples we talked about earlier. It's where we look around, that feeling of desperation with nowhere to turn. And our main characters this morning, today's story, are living out that sense of desperation right before our eyes. So with this said, go ahead and turn with me, if you have your Bibles, to Mark chapter 5. We'll be in Mark 5 for the rest of our time this morning. The words will be on the screen as well as usual. We'll be in Mark 5. We'll start in verse 21. It reads, "When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea." So Mark tells us here that a great crowd gathered around Jesus. In Mark's gospel in particular, this is a recurring theme, where the crowd is like a character to itself, and the crowd is overwhelming. I often tell my students that reading Mark should feel like you're watching a zombie movie. The crowd's like, following Jesus everywhere, heal me, feed me, all the rest. And that's what Jesus is dealing with here. The crowd is overwhelming him, and they just keep on coming, more and more and more. And in the middle of this madness, a man finally pushes through all the craziness, all the zombies, if you will, makes his way to Jesus. And then look at verses 22 and 23. "Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jarius came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly." Now you hear the desperation. "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." Can you feel his desperation? And just look at how Mark describes what's going on here. One of the leaders of the synagogue named Jarius comes, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet. He begged him repeatedly. Then notice how he calls her, "My little daughter You feel that. My little daughter is at the point of death. She's not just sick, she's at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may live. Now the zombie crowd is pushing in, but this desperate father pushed through, and he found the last hope that he could cling to. This traveling prophet teacher from Nazareth, Jesus. Now Mark tells us that the man's name is Jairus. And he tells us that Jairus is the leader of the synagogue. Now given that he's the leader of the synagogue, that tells us he's probably pretty wealthy. Also tells us that he has a lot of connections in town. And given that he's wealthy and has a lot of connections, I'm making the assumption that he's tried other avenues to heal his daughter. He probably paid for doctors. He had the money. He probably asked other religious leaders to pray for her and lay hands on her. He knew people, but despite all of this, nothing was happening. His daughter was still at the point of death, Mark tells us. Jairus pushed through, falls at Jesus' feet, begs him repeatedly, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. This is his desperation. And it worked. Verse 24, so he went with him. Great. So Jesus goes with Jairus to go heal this little girl. But that's only the first half of Mark 5:24. Look at this next half. And a large crowd followed Jesus and pressed in on him. You know, this doggone crowd just won't go away. Don't they know that this guy's little girl is sick? You know, the ambulance is trying to drive through. The lights are on and everything. Like, y'all need to pull over. Get out of the way. But that's not how it goes. The crowd, which by now is really becoming a nuisance, is pressing in on Jesus. You know, I'm putting myself in Jairus' shoes for a moment. Let me tell you, man, if my last hope of saving my little daughter's life is getting blocked by a bunch of morons who are needing Jesus to address whatever need they're dealing with, I'm pretty sure I know what I would do. I would do my best linebacker impersonation. I'd push every loser out of the way so that I can get Jesus from point A to point B, which is my sick daughter laying in bed. It's like the hallways in high school all over again. Just get out of the way, moron. I need to get to biology. Get out of the way. Don't they see that this is serious? Don't they know that this guy's daughter is about to die? He's the synagogue leader. They should know this dude. What's wrong with these people? Move. I fear Jairus' desperation building. And in the middle of this madness, of this desperation, our second main character appears on the scene. And she's desperate too, just like Jairus. Look at verse 25. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Now this sounds truly terrible. This poor woman has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years! And the bleeding that Mark describes here is likely menstruation. And it's a deeply personal thing that she's facing, a deeply personal health crisis. It's more than just an aggravating nuisance. It's much worse than just that. This is a health crisis that she's facing that has huge implications for her life. According to Leviticus chapter 15, a woman who is bleeding like this is unclean while she's in this state. And that means a husband is forbidden from sleeping with her. And this means that anywhere she goes, she makes everyone around her unclean. And so for this reason, and also just obviously because of the type of health condition she's facing, this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years is unable to have children. And tradition commonly taught that a man married to a woman who couldn't bear children was allowed to divorce her for that reason. So we don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that either she had been married and been divorced by her husband, or perhaps never got to get married because of this very serious health crisis that she's facing. This is a significant issue that has huge implications for how she lives her life. You want to talk about desperation. She tried everything. Look at verse 26. She had endured much under many physicians, and it's been all that she had. She was no better, but rather grew worse. How horrifying, right? How hopeless, how desperate. She spent all of the money she had on doctors, and she's only getting worse. She had been bleeding for 12 years. Her entire life savings was not enough to make her better. Now, by this point, after bleeding for 12 years, after spending all of your money on doctors, most people would have assumed that she was cursed. There's no reason she should be going through a crisis like this. This must not be just a medical issue in the eyes of many people. This must be a curse from God himself. And on top of the obvious health issues and relationship issues that she's likely facing because of this serious health condition, she's out of money, she's poor. Her neighbors probably think that God has cursed her. She perhaps has internalized some of that. Perhaps she's internalized some of the shame. What did she do to deserve this curse from God? What are her neighbors thinking about her? So this poor woman is alone. She's literally financially poor. She's desperate. And then look at her desperation, verses 27 and 28. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. So she had heard about Jesus, this traveling prophet teacher from Nazareth. And she's tried everything else. She spent all of her money. Maybe Jesus can heal her. So she thinks, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Now look, this is some amazing faith, right? To think that simply by touching the guy's clothing, Jesus would heal her. But that shows what she thinks about Jesus. She recognizes something special in Jesus, yes. Great faith, but is also extremely bold. She knows that she's unclean. I'm pretty sure that lots of people told her that she was unclean. She knows that Leviticus 15 says that she's unclean. She knows that Leviticus 15 says that a woman who's bleeding like she is makes everything around her unclean. She knows that everything she touches becomes unclean too, and if someone touches the thing you touched, they become unclean too. She knows all of this stuff. Again, I'm pretty sure a lot of people reminded her of that multiple times. I'm sure lots of people had mansplained to her over the last 12 years of her life as she's going through this health crisis. But she's desperate, so she doesn't care. She does it anyway. She goes out and touches his clothes anyway. And it worked. Look at verse 29. Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Can you imagine the sense of relief that must have hit this woman at this point? For 12 years, she had been living with this health condition. For 12 years, she had asked help from every doctor she could find, spent all of her money. For 12 years, she had sought a cure. For 12 years, she was hopeless. 12 years. And now she goes out and touches Jesus' clothes, and she's healed in 12 seconds. Well, Mark actually says immediately. I just thought 12 seconds would be cool. She's healed immediately. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. She's free for the first time in 12 years. The bleeding is gone. The shame is gone. That weight of desperation is gone. But then I suspect a new panic hit her next in verse 30. Check it out. Immediately, aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Now I have to tell you, if I were this woman, I would have freaked out a little bit. I'm not going to lie. I would have been scared. She knows, because again, people had mansplained this to her for 12 years. She knew that if she touched this dude, according to Leviticus 15, she was making him unclean. Now maybe at first she thought she got away with it. Now I'll kind of sneak in, touch the dude's clothes, maybe no one will notice. But oh, he noticed. He asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now before the woman has a chance to speak up, Jesus' disciples say what we're all thinking in verse 31. And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd that's pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" Like, for real, Jesus? Like, remember the whole zombie crowd thing? They're all pressing in on you? Dude, people are touching you constantly. What do you mean, who touched you, dude? People are touching you everywhere. Are you kidding me with this? But Jesus knows that something different has happened. This is more than just someone bumping into him. So he asks, presses further, verse 32. He looked around to see who had done it. Now, if I were this woman, again, I'd really start to sweat now. The disciples, they kind of tried to run defense for me, right? They're like, dude, people are touching you all the time. Just move on. Just forget about it. They tried to help, but Jesus isn't going to forget about it. He starts looking around further for the person who touched him. I'd be sweating if I were the woman. But the woman fesses up to the whole truth in the next verse. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. See, she's scared. She's shaking. Fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Her desperation is back. She's terrified. Mark says she came in fear and trembling, shaking. She doesn't know at this moment how Jesus is going to react, right? She's never spoken with this man before. All she knows about Jesus is that he's a holy teacher who heals people. And she just made this holy teacher unclean in a huge crowd by bringing this disease around. Who knows who else she touched in this wild crowd? She doesn't know how he's going to react. How is this holy teacher, how is Jesus going to react? She doesn't know. Is Jesus going to be mad at her? Is he going to yell at her? Is he going to point out to everybody what she did and shame her in front of the whole crowd? Is he going to take a moment to mansplain Leviticus 15 to her and lecture her over it, like so many other people had probably done? She has no idea. She doesn't know how he's going to react. And so she comes in fear and in trembling. But she's still bold, isn't she? She's bold enough to touch Jesus' clothes in the first place. And she's bold again right here because she comes and tells him the whole truth. To be clear, this woman is scared, but she is not weak. She tells the whole truth. And then see the beautiful words that Jesus says to her in the next verse, verse 34. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." You see what he calls her? He calls her daughter. I wonder when the last time she ever heard someone say that to her. Daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Wonder when the last time she had peace was. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Everything is better. Jesus fixed it in a moment. It's been 12 years of pain, 12 years of isolation, 12 years of desperation, and all of that is over. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. It's one of the most beautiful scenes in all of Scripture, I think. And it's an important scene for us because we get a clear picture of God's heart in his exchange with this woman. To remind us, the woman did not know how Jesus would react when she touched him. She didn't know. Would he be mad? Would he shame her? Would he lecture her? She literally didn't know. But she knows now. He called her daughter. Now, because of this woman's faith, that tells me that you and I can know Jesus' reaction to us, too. You don't have to wonder like she must have had to wonder. No matter what you're going through this morning, no matter what your point of desperation, thanks to this woman's faith, we know Jesus' answer. Your desperation, like this woman, could be a health crisis. Your desperation could be a relationship struggle. It could be financial. Perhaps this morning your desperation is an ongoing addiction or a struggle with sin. Whatever your desperation is this morning, thanks to this woman's faith, you already know Jesus' reaction. He's not going to be mad at you. He's not going to shame you. He's not going to lecture you. He's not going to ignore you. We know his answer already. It's in Scripture, daughter or son. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Look, a fundamental truth that we as Christians believe, this is really basic, is that Jesus is God. You know, we teach that in VBS, preschool, all the way up. As a Christian, that's what we believe. Jesus is God. Basic Christian teaching. Now, if you say that in the reverse, God is Jesus, that's also true. And so what that tells me is that we know what God is like by looking at Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Look, all of us have these images of God in our mind. That's natural. Now, for most of us, our mental picture of God is often shaped by our relationships with our fathers. Be that good, be that bad, be that non-existent. But let me tell you that whatever image of God you have in your mind this morning, listen to me, if your picture of God does not look like Jesus, you have a skewed picture of God. If your picture of God in your mind this morning would never tell you daughter or son, Your faith has made you well, go in peace. Then the God that you have in your mind right now is not Jesus. That's a different God. Our God that we serve met this desperate woman. And friends, Jesus is ready to tell you too, your faith has made you well, go in peace. This is the God that we serve. Not the vengeful God who's out to get you. We serve the God who loves you so much he sent his son to do things like this and ultimately to die on the cross and rise from the dead for us. Okay, so back to our story. Did you forget about Jairus and his daughter? I almost did. Well, Jairus probably thought that Jesus forgot about him too. Remember Jairus? His daughter's about to die. He begged Jesus to come and heal his little girl. Then they get hung up by the crowd, and then this woman comes into the scene. Now, Mark doesn't tell us what Jairus is doing in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. He doesn't show up. But let me tell you, I've got a daughter around the same age as Jairus' daughter, so I'm pretty sure I know what I would be doing in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. I'd be pacing, right? I'd be looking at my watch. I'd be checking my phone for texts. I'd be tapping my foot. I'd be asking Bartholomew or Simon or Andrew or anybody to go tell Jesus to hurry it up. Like, get your act together, man. I'd be panicked. My daughter is about to die. Dude, I told you this. Stop wasting your time in a huge crowd. Get moving. You're asking who touched you. Dude, we don't got time for this. My daughter's about to die. I done told you that. And then, to say the least, I would have lost my mind in verse 35. Take a look. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" It's like, what? I told you, Jesus. I told you we were desperate. Dude, if you weren't going to take me seriously, just told me to go home. At least I could have been with my daughter when she died. But you're talking about people touching you in the middle of a crowd. But my daughter's dead, man. My desperation would have turned to anger. I would have been mad at Jesus. I'm not proud of you. I'm just being honest with you. I would have been mad at Jesus. I would have been mad at the crowd. I would have been mad at the woman with the ongoing health crisis. I would have been mad at the disciples for not speaking up for me. I would have been mad at myself for going to the wrong guy for help. I think if you're honest, you would have been mad too. And Jesus knows it. Then look at what he says in verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Pastor Darrell rightly pointed out last week that the number one command we get from God is don't fear. Here's an example of that. Do not fear, only believe. Jesus is going to fix it. Just as he healed the woman, Jesus is going to step in and he's going to address this man's desperation. Look at the next few verses, starting in verse 37. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of Jesus. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, only sleeping." And they laughed at him. So Jesus and the disciples come to the house, and they meet a big group of people who are weeping and wailing. And this big group of people are probably professional mourners. That was a job back then. People would hire you to go to a funeral and cry. My grandpa used to make fun of my grandma because she cried everywhere. She'd be perfect at that. He said, "You should have been a professional weeper." It's a whole thing, and it's an important role, particularly in the ancient world. So they'd go into situations like this, and they'd mourn with the family. So Jesus tells these professional mourners that the child isn't dead, she's only sleeping. And they laugh at him in verse 40. They laugh because they're professional mourners, right? They've been around death a lot. They've been around death enough to know when somebody's dead. And dude, this little girl ain't sleeping. This little girl is dead. Jesus is making a fool of himself in front of all these professional mourners. But Jesus ain't no fool. Look at the rest of the story. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by her hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. And at this, they were overcome with amazement. Now, this beautiful scene with Jesus and the little girl echoes what we just saw with Jesus and the woman. Jesus reaches out and touches the little girl's hand. Remember with the bleeding woman, to touch a bleeding woman like that would make you unclean, but Jesus didn't care. Touching a dead body like this little girl also makes you unclean, according to Numbers chapter 19. But Jesus doesn't care. He touches her anyway. And then Mark gives us Jesus' exact words in Aramaic, his native tongue, Talitha kum, which Mark translates for us, little girl, get up. All of Jairus' desperation melted away with these two Aramaic words, Talitha kum, and the little girl got up. Jesus met Jairus at his point of just desperation. Jesus gave life into the most hopeless situation Jairus had ever faced. Jairus experienced the peace that Julian of Norwich would express in the late 14th century when she said, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. Jesus raised Jairus' daughter. The desperation was gone. All was well. Now we need to finish up the story. Look at the final verse, verse 43. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. I have to admit, this is kind of weird. Scholars have puzzled over this. Why does Jesus tell them not to say anything? Now, this is a running motif in Mark's gospel especially. And a few years ago when I was here for a winter Bible study, we spent a whole message on this motif. I'm sure like 3 of you remember it and the rest of you didn't even know it existed. But I was here, and we talked about it. But Jairus is a synagogue leader. He just went through a huge crowd and a desperate frenzy. And if my reconstruction is right, he's losing his mind in front of everybody. Everybody knows about his daughter. He had a bunch of professional mourners here weeping and wailing and making a scene. And now Jesus tells them, dude, don't tell nobody? Are you kidding me with that? How's he not supposed to tell anybody? So he's supposed to go out and, nah. Turned out he was right. She was just asleep. Didn't die. Just a flesh wound. We're good. She's better now. She got all better by herself. Well, probably not. It wouldn't make any sense. So I think what Jesus is doing here is 3 different things, kind of all at once. First, when he tells them to give her something to eat, I think he's showing everybody that she actually is alive. You know, they're not dreaming. She's not a ghost or something like that. She really is alive. She's eating. She's with them. You can touch her. She's alive. So I think Jesus is giving them some time to process what has just happened. Your daughter who was dead is now alive. That has to be a shock. It takes a while to kind of let that shock sit in. So I think he's giving them some time to process. Second, I think Jesus is giving Jairus the same gift that he gave the woman in verse 34. Remember what he tells the woman. He says, go in peace. He's giving Jairus and his family permission to take a break. You know, Jairus doesn't have to run out and start telling everybody right away what happened. You're like, dude, it's okay. Rest. Enjoy your daughter. Take a break. As Jesus is going to say later, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We're going to talk about that next week. That's the message for next week. Take a rest. And third and finally, I think there's some kind of reverse psychology at work here too. Not so much for Jairus, but for us. You know, obviously, Jairus could not have kept this miracle hidden. That's really a silly request. There's no way he could not tell people his dead daughter is now alive. He couldn't keep that hidden. But if we really understand what happened for us as the readers, we can't really let it stay quiet either. You know, Jesus strictly warned Jairus not to tell anybody, but he doesn't strictly warn us not to tell anybody. And friends, if Jesus has met you at some point, be it now or in the past, if Jesus has met you at your point of desperation, give thanks to God. Rest, take a break, enjoy what God has given you. Enjoy the peace that you have because of Jesus. And once you're rested, once you've enjoyed that peace, it's time to go out. Tell people. Tell your friends and your family. So many of the people we meet are desperate. Go take this message of Jesus' healing of desperation and tell them that Jesus has done this for me. He did it for Jairus. He did it for this woman. He can do it for you too.